Thank you for coming to our meeting today, Coffee Cups and Flying Saucers. I am the MUFON New Mexico State Director, Maria Tellier, and I want to thank you for tuning in today for our presentation. The abduction of Charles Moody was 50 years ago on August 12th. He was 32 at the time of the abduction, so he would be 82 today. That's if he's still alive. But Charles Moody was never heard from again after he left Holloman and his family moved away from Alamogordo. The Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization, APRO, who investigated this case, was never able to make contact with Moody, and this event is still a little known abduction, most likely due to the fact that he was active duty in the United States Air Force at the time of the abduction. I reviewed the archives at the Alamogordo Daily News, which are on microfiche at the city library, and I was unable to find any references to the Moody story. However, there were many APRO stories that were available on microfiche. APRO only published this story 10 months after it happened in the APRO Bulletin. There's some reference to it in books published by the Lorenzens and also by Wendell Stevens, but the Richard Dolan podcast with Alan Levine, which was called the APRO Insider, that was the most information I was able to find about that abduction that was readily available. Staff Sergeant Charles Moody worked at Holloman Air Force Base as a cargo aircraft mechanic and had over 700 hours of flight time. He worked swing shift, getting done at 11:30 p.m. Again, he was 32 years old and he'd been in the Air Force for 13 years. He lived with his wife and two children in Alamogordo, and on the night of August 12, 1975, after finishing his shift, Sergeant Moody went home, changed his clothes, and decided to drive out into the desert and watch the annual Perseid Meteor showers. Working nights, Staff Sergeant Moody frequently saw beautiful displays of meteors while driving home on Route 70, and he heard from the locals of Alamogordo that the meteors were vibrant in our dark skies and best viewed from the desert. Yearly, the Perseid meteor showers are visible from July to September, and they are crazy active on August 12th and 13th, with 50 to 100 meteors per hour from 10 p.m. until dawn. On August 12th, 1975, the moon was in its waxing crescent phase, and it was just 43% illuminated. It had risen in the east at 1:03 p.m. that afternoon, and it was to set around 1:39 a.m. on August 13th in the west. That's towards Las Cruces. It would have been at his back. This is the Earth Sky Com view, and it gives us a view of the sky and shows us what is called the radiant on the left side of the screen. This is where the meteors originate from. The radiant for the Perseids is to the northeast, so he was looking to the area around La Luz. I believe he drove out into the desert closer to his home in town, and that would have been on the north side of Route 70. So he had a clear view of the sky to the northeast, and I'm sure he wasn't too close to the Sacramento Mountains, so he could get a good view of the sky. Earth encounters the Perseids as Earth passes closest to the core of the comet 109P Swift-Tuttle. The strongest rates occur August 12th and 13th. This comet has an orbit of 133 years. In 1992, it entered the inner solar system and was at its closest to us. Many of the brighter Perseids meteors will leave behind trains which appear to be like smoke trails, but they're actually not smoke. They're ionized air, and they're a result of the meteor quickly passing through the atmosphere where the air molecules are then ionized, creating that glow. We see it as like a smoky streak after the meteor has disappeared. Most of these trains only last a second or two, but those lasting longer, they appear to twist and turn in the winds of the upper atmosphere, and it distorts them. They kind of remind me of those old bottle rockets you used to shoot off when we were kids. You put them in an empty beer can and they would go up. They didn't go straight up. They had kind of like a corkscrew thing to them. So Route 70, or as we call it, the Holloman Highway, traveling east towards Alamogordo between the base and town in 1975 was pretty desolate, just desert. The used auto dealerships on either side of 70 that we see now were not there, but those farms that are way off into the distance and those ranches, those were there. They've been there for generations. These ranches are only the only thing between the base and the town. There was no traffic lights on Airport Road and South Walker, and that mobile home park, Amber Skies, on the north side of 70, it wasn't even built yet. The Alamogordo Airport was built in 1959, and it was accessible via Airport Road. But all those double-wide communities and the Otero County Jail had not been built yet. There were a few homes scattered throughout that Walkertown area, but none of those trailer parks or mobile homes and gone into that area in great numbers yet. There was no relief road. It was just desert. And none of those fast food or those big hotels were in the town along White Sands. All businesses and establishments were like little mom and pop shops, like the Waffle House, which is still there. The population of Alamogordo was around 21,000, which is about 10,000 less than it is now. I put that checkered oval that you see on the map there because I think that's the area that Moody was parked in when he went out to view the meteor showers. There was a dirt road there. It was on Lavelle Road, and it went out to the dump, which was there. So I drove out to Lavelle Road to see what it was like. I took this picture from Brabson Park on the northeast side. That's the Sacramento Mountains in the La Luz area on our side of the mountains. High Rolls is on the other side of the mountains. This is a great location even today to watch the skies. But those telephone poles and that chain link fence, none of that stuff would have been there. And that probably was a dirt road out there going out to the dump. The moon was to the west, so it was at Moody's back, and it was very, very dark. Perfect for viewing meteors. At 1:20 a.m. on the morning now of August 13th, Moody was watching the shower of fireballs in the sky while sitting on the left fender of his Corvette. One really large meteor caught his attention, and as he watched it, he thought it was coming right at him. It grew larger and larger, and it became a bright white glow. When it was within 100 feet of his location, he could see clearly that it was not a fireball at all. It was a dull gray craft. This is what Staff Sergeant Moody saw. A craft that stopped dead and just hung in the air 10 to 20 feet off the ground right in front of him. He looked at it, estimating the craft to be 50 feet across. He noticed several globes of glass on the bottom and a large window in the front. When he looked closely at that large window in the front, he could see 2 or 3 humanoid figures looking back at him. When he saw those humanoids looking back at him, he was startled. He jumped off the hood of his car and he ran to the front seat and he tried to start it, but it wouldn't start. He sat there panicking. and looking at this object hovering through his windshield, and he began to hear a drilling noise. He said it was like a dentist drill. And then his car enveloped in a fog. He could feel his body going numb, but he also felt a calmness come over him, and he lost consciousness. And then the next thing he remembers is waking up in the front seat of the car and watching this same craft lifting straight up and then leaving the area at a high rate of speed. He looked at his watch, and now it was 2:45 a.m. He had lost 90 minutes of time. He was groggy, and he could not remember what had happened after the fog enveloped his car. His car would now start, and he drove home to his wife, who was waiting for him. She was very worried because he was so late. He told her everything he remembered, but all that he could remember was seeing this object approach his car, running into the front seat, and then not being able to start the car. His next memories were of the object leaving and checking his watch. She believed him, but she was very concerned about his condition and his state of mind. Over the next few days, he was still unable to remember the minutes of missing time and had become quite frustrated because he felt something else had happened to him. He just couldn't remember what it was. So he went looking for answers. He started by purchasing a magazine about UFOs. He read it and wrote a letter to the editor of the magazine, asking him to help him find out what had happened to him, because he just could not remember what had happened for 90 minutes of that night. Now, Moody didn't know anything about UFOs. He had actually made fun of people who said they saw them. He went to downtown Alamogordo to a newsstand and found a magazine that had a big picture of a UFO on it, and that's the one he bought. He asked the editor of UFO magazine not to contact him at Holloman, but to call his home phone, and he listed his home phone number. They could call and they could leave a message with his wife, but please, please forward the request for help to whomever they felt could help him to remember what had happened to him that night. On August 20th, 7 days after the event, his request was forwarded by the UFO magazine editor to the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization, APRO. Jim Lorenzen of APRO called Moody at his home the next day, but Moody was working. His wife had asked Jim Lorenzen to please call back the next day, which was then August 21st. She told Lorenzen her husband really needed to speak to someone who could help him remember what happened that night. So APRO called him the next day, and Moody told them what he remembered about watching the meteor showers and then the missing time in the morning of August 13th. He could still only remember looking into that window, the fog in the car, and the craft leaving. He was very, very frustrated, and he had become ill after the encounter. He had made an appointment in El Paso, Texas, with a doctor because he didn't want the base doctors to know about his injuries. Jim Lorenzen advised him to go, but don't tell them about what had happened that night. Moody had developed a rash on the lower parts of his body. It looked a lot like a heat rash. He was sore all over and told Jim Lorenzen he felt like someone had hit him with a baseball bat, but he could find no bruises or marks on his body. He also often felt lightheaded. Jim Lorenzen knew these symptoms were also present when someone had radiation poisoning, and he was concerned for Moody's health. Moody followed Lorenzen's advice. He did not tell the doctor in El Paso about the incident in the desert, and after examination, the doctor told Moody to just go home and get some rest. Unknown to Moody, Jim Lorenzen had recorded the initial conversation, sending it out for evaluation to PSE inventor Charles McQuiston. The Psychological Stress Evaluator, PSE, processes the sound of your voice by detecting stress. Stress indicates lying or untruthfulness. Police still use these for evaluation since the PSE process, it processes voice sounds and they don't require attaching sensors like a polygraph, and they don't need to get a warrant. Witness interviews are often recorded, reviewed, and then evaluated for truthfulness, but those results are not submittable in court. After evaluation of the conversation between Moody and Lorenzen, it was determined that Moody was being truthful in his conversation. Needing and wanting additional information regarding this event, APRO decided to travel to Alamogordo for an in-person interview. There were many phone calls between everyone at APRO and Moody. They all had become quite friendly and respectful of each other. Moody had developed a trust and was hopeful that APRO could help him to remember what had happened that night. So just 20 days after the event, September 2nd, Jim Lorenzen and Wendell Stevens of APRO flew to Alamogordo and interviewed their new buddy, Chuck Moody. Wendell Stevens was the pilot, and he flew them from Tucson, Arizona to Alamogordo White Sands Regional. Stevens was a former lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, a longtime APRO investigator and author. Stevens and Jim Lorenzen wrote several books together, and Moody was comfortable with both of them, maybe because Jim and Wendell were both former Air Force. Jim had also been in the Air Force and security forces. After speaking with Staff Sergeant Moody in person, both Jim and Wendell found him to be responsible, kind, and a conscientious person who had in fact experienced something that he just could not relate to. When discussing the event, he was very confused and unsettled, but was almost desperate to know what had happened to him that night in the desert. Moody took Jim and Wendell to his home, and they interviewed his wife, Karen. She was a registered nurse, and she told them about her memories from that night. She said her husband had come home very late, around 3 o'clock in the morning, looking pale and sick. He told her about seeing the flying saucer while watching the meteor showers. She was concerned about his physical condition and was glad he saw the doctor, but his mental state was another matter. She believed her husband had something unexplainable happen to him, but she was also very afraid to talk about it to anyone, fearing her husband would be labeled as crazy. Moody took Jim and Wendell to the site where he had parked to watch the Perseids, so they could investigate the location for trace evidence. Although they did not find any evidence of a landing, they did notice Moody becoming quite agitated while at this location. He told them he had feelings of apprehension and fear, and he wanted to run away. Several times during the interview, Chuck pointed out that he had commando training and was not afraid of any man. He was also very defensive. Those feelings were not so nearly pronounced when he was questioned back at the house and never on the phone. It was very evident that something very traumatic had happened to Staff Sergeant Moody at that location. But still, on September 2nd, Moody was unable to remember anything that happened during the 90 minutes of missing time. Jim and Wendell told Moody to relax and assured him that in time his memories of that night would return to him. He just needed to be patient, but most importantly, do not discuss this with anyone at the base. So after the APRO interview, Moody was still very frustrated by his inability to remember what had happened to him. Even though APRO had told him not to discuss it with anyone on base, he still looked up an old fishing buddy, Dr. Abraham Goldman, a former flight surgeon who was now a civilian neurosurgeon. Moody confided in Dr. Goldman the experience of August 13th, and the doctor advised Moody to try a method of meditation called self-hypnosis. Self-hypnosis bears some similarities to meditation in that it puts the body into a very relaxed state, but it is more focused than standard meditative practices. He taught Moody the process because he had a feeling this might restore Moody's lost memories. Through September of 1975, Moody began practicing this process, and slowly his memories began to surface, ending with a full recall of the entire event by October. On September 29th, Sergeant Moody spoke with APRO, and he told them that his memories were slowly returning, and they encouraged him to start recording these memories, start writing them down. He also told them he had received orders. He said his leadership wanted him to ship out immediately, but he told them he had to sell his home in Alamogordo and make arrangements for his family. His wife had a job and his kids were in school, and he could not leave that quickly. The date to ship out was changed to November 29th. Moody spoke on the phone with APRO again on October 6th and told them he now had a full recall of the event. They continued to encourage him to write everything down, his memories, his feelings, and every little detail he could recall, and send it to them for evaluation. A letter to Carl and Jim Lorenzen was received in APRO's mail on November 15th. After reading this letter, they were unable to make phone contact with Moody. The number had been disconnected. All contact with him was lost, and they were never able to make contact with him again. The drawings that you see throughout this were made by Alan Levine, who was on staff at APRO. He told the story of Staff Sergeant Moody on the Richard Dolan podcast, The APRO Insider. He gives lots of little known details regarding this investigation and his interactions with Moody in 1975. In Moody's letter, he had described the craft's interior and the beings that he now remembers from that night. In the letter, Sergeant Moody began his narrative with, "What I saw that night on board their craft were things I cannot explain, but I can only try. The inside of the craft was as clean as an operating room. I cannot say if the fixtures were metal or plastic. The lighting was indirect. I did not see any source of light, but there was light." Moody had always remembered seeing the outside of the craft. He saw it approach his car. When he woke up, he saw it leave. But now he feels that the interior that he remembers was much too large compared to the exterior that he remembers seeing that night. He now remembers waking up on board the craft, laying on a metal table. The air smelled like burnt sugar. It was thick and it was very difficult to breathe. The interior was smooth with no sharp edges or right angles. He could hear that high-pitched whine like a dentist drill, and this really made him anxious. He recalls laying on that table, unable to move, but he could see that indirect light above him and a domed white roof. Moody stated that there were three beings watching him, one who he called the Elder and two others. They were 5 feet tall, and they looked very much like us, except their heads were larger and they had no hair. The skin on their heads was wrinkly, and their ears were very small. They had eyes a little bigger than our eyes, but their nose was smaller, and they had very thin lips. He would say their weight was maybe between 110 and 130 pounds. They wore clothing that was skin tight, and he could not see any zippers or buttons. The elder, who he felt was the leader, had wore a silvery white suit, and the other two, they wore all black. The elder spoke with Moody telepathically, and he was told that this was just a landing craft. There was a mothership about 400 miles away. At that time, Moody had noticed that there was a rod across the back of his legs, and it was glowing, a glowing light. He was told that this was administered because he had fought with them, and they used the rod to calm him down. Moody was told not to touch the rod, but if he behaved, they would remove it. Moody says, I have no recall of ever engaging with them physically. Throughout this ordeal inside the craft, Moody kept his head and his wits about him. He began using his Airforce training to question and observe his captors more closely. Moody was assigned to the 49th MXG Maintenance Squadron as a mechanic. He worked on cargo plane engines. He recalls thinking, if only I could see the drive unit of this craft, how wonderful that would be. But before I could ask for a tour, the elder took me down by elevator into the lower level of the ship. It had 3 levels. I was examined on the middle floor, and the engine room was below. I was never taken to the top floor. Moody said there was speech, but their lips did not move. They called me Charles, except the elder, who called me son. When I asked the elder, who are you and where are you from? The elder said, we are explorers, historians, scientists, traders, and doctors, just like you. We come from a very specific quarter of the universe, and someday in the near future, you will understand. Moody finished his letter to APRO with, their intent is a peaceful one, but they also fear for their own lives and will protect themselves at all costs. It's not up to us to accept them, but for them to accept us. I was unable to find a copy of the official UFO magazine. I wanted to find the one with the UFO on the front that Moody had actually went and purchased, but I was unable to do that. And APRO did not publish the Moody abduction until June and July of 1976. That was 10 months after the event. Moody had asked the Lorenzens not to publish his name, but after the Moody family was shipped out to points unknown, APRO was unable to ever make contact with them again. APRO tried to explain why they waited so long to publish this event. They had said that Moody had asked them to keep his identity secret, and they obliged. They buried his story on page 6 in the 1976 June issue of the APRO Bulletin. The conclusion of the story had made it to page 2 in the July Bulletin. I reviewed the archives of the Alamogordo News. I was unable to find any reference to Charles Moody anywhere in it. There is some reference in the books published by Lorenzen and Wendell Stevens, but that Richard Dolan podcast with Alan Levine, from December of 2023 was very informative because Levine was working at APRO. Really, he was a volunteer. But he did a lot of the interview process with Moody. He drew the images of the crafts from Moody's description to him over the phone. Now, Levine also did the same for Travis Walton. The Travis Walton abduction was in November of 1975, just 3 months after the Moody abduction. Levine was able to discuss how he found evidence and similarities between these two events on that Dolan podcast. Fortunately, this resulted in Moody's case and Walton's collaborating with each other in a rather striking manner. The 4 abduction cases that I have up here on the screen were investigated by APRO, and they have several similarities. They include, most importantly, the beings communicated telepathically, and that their clothing was described as uniforms. There was information that was not shared with the public. The Lorenzen used this tactic, as they called it, to weed out the crazies. They kept some information back, and then when they interviewed people who said they saw the same thing, they could tell if they were talking a line of crap or not because they had the real evidence that they never released. I spoke about Alan Levine, who worked for APRO, and he was a graphic artist. And as I said earlier, he did a series actually with Richard Dolan, about his time with APRO. And Dolan drove him pretty hard to get him to discuss some of the cases. And after a lot of badgering, Levine said that there were 4 cases that has 2 very important things that all 4 of these cases have in common. The beings felt like marshmallows when touched. They had a dusty gray pallor that was wrinkly. And the interior of all 4 crafts had no right angles or sharp edges, giving it the appearance of melted wax. They felt these cases were somehow related to each other. And actually, Levine, he didn't want to give up that information because he felt that some people may still be investigating these cases. But Dolan assured him nobody's investigating these cases anymore. Interesting that the Moody, the Hills, and Travis Walton abductions were all in the fall. It's the 50th anniversary of Walton's and Moody's abductions, and it's been 64 years since the Hills were abducted. APRO didn't speak much about the abduction experience until the Travis Walton event. Since we have a little bit of time, I just wanted to talk more about abduction cases. I get the New Mexico abduction or ERT cases for investigation. After I'm done with them, I turn them over to the experiencer research team, the ERT team, for evaluation after I complete, the general stuff like weather, witness verification, and the timeline. The experiencer side of the investigation must be performed by someone who is trained or an individual who has had a similar experience. The professionals on the team are an array of mental and medical health fields, and they're willing and they're able to handle the investigation of this specific type of case. MUFON has a page on the MUFON website with each ERT team member and their credentials and experience. They have the experience and the knowledge to handle this type of interview without adding to the experiencer's trauma. Abduction is the action of taking someone away by force or deception against one's will and often for a harmful purpose. The aspects of abduction are lack of consent, capture, force, and this makes it a criminal act. It's not a kidnapping because kidnapping involves asking for a ransom, but it's still a criminal act. Yeah, I'm sure there's some individuals out there asking to be abduction or taken away, and I believe their perception of that is skewed, probably skewed by movies and television shows that show it like it's some big wonderful thing. But the reality, alien abduction is not that pretty. In most cases, if and when the abductee has full recall of the event, it's terrifying and life-changing. An abductee often has a memory block of the event. It's a psychological defense mechanism to either consciously or unconsciously avoid confronting, processing, or expressing difficult emotions or memories about what had happened to them. There's always been a dispute as to whether we as humans just block this ourselves or if the abductor, if the alien places the block in our subconsciousness. This block was in place for Staff Sergeant Moody, who used a self-meditated process to regain the memories of his abduction event. Prior to regaining his memories, Moody had become combative and angry. And when confronted with the reality of what happened to him, he was confused, had the sweats, lightheadedness, sleeplessness, and was very argumentative. After he unlocked his suppressed memories, he returned to his carefree, happy go lucky self, but had gained the clarity of what had happened to him that night. The hills are an excellent example of both Betty and Barney Hill had been taken on board a craft and were examined by their abductors and had to have, after their abduction, they had hypnotic therapy with an Army trained doctor who had previously treated soldiers who had, back in the day, they didn't call it PTSD, they called it being shell shot. But that's what he had done when he was in the Army. When he was in civilian practice, he met with the Hills. He hypnotized them. Their he recorded their sessions, and they were two very different sessions to the same event. Betty felt that the aliens were benevolent, they were caring, they were well-being, but Barney thought they were malevolent. They wished to do evil upon others, and he had a terrifying experience. I remember reading parts of Barney Hill's interview with the doctor while he was hypnotized, and he was saying that he could see the abductors putting needles into Betty as she laid on the table, and there was nothing he could do to help her. He felt so helpless as a husband that he could not help his wife, and that traumatized him. As were Betty, in the beginning she was traumatized, but she said they did something to them, and that one of her captors had actually told her, "You'll never remember any of this. Just relax," and took her about the ship, and she had a very pleasant experience. So both of the Hills had the same experience with two very different perceptions of it after they regained their memories. So I will be talking more about the Travis Walton case in our November meeting, but our next meeting in October will have a guest speaker, Lynn Buchanan. Lynn Buchanan is going to donate his time to take us into the fascinating world of controlled remote viewing. CRV, as it's called. He'll talk to us about that in the October 18th meeting. If you guys remember, I spoke about him when we had our lecture about the famous people in the Tularosa Basin in ufology. He was featured in the movie Men Who Stare at Goats. George Clooney had actually played Lynn Buchanan in the movie, and the movie was about the Army and CIA's Project Stargate. Lynn Buchanan lives in Alamo and has a ranch in Tularosa where he teaches remote viewing, and he has sky watches. So Please pass this on to your friends at Facebook and Instagram. He's an expert on remote viewing, and we're really honored to have him speak with us in October. There's a free screening of a documentary, First We Bombed New Mexico. It's going to be at the Flickinger Theater on New York Avenue, and it's sponsored by Holloman Air Force Base. It's going to be October 11th at 2 p.m. Thousands of New Mexicans, mostly Hispanic and Native, were exposed to catastrophic levels of radioactive fallout. They were never warned, never acknowledged, and never helped afterwards. Generations of cancers have followed. It's urgent that the American public finally know the consequences of the Trinity bomb to us here in New Mexico. We need to demand justice for the countless lives that were lost and destroyed. Our good friends up at Albuquerque UFOs have some upcoming presentations in the Albuquerque area on October 4th. They're having a really big show with Charles Hall at the University of New Mexico at their Continuing Education Center. Charles Hall wrote that great series of books, Millennial Hospitality and Walking with Tall Whites. It was regarding his years as a physicist at Nellis Field in Indian Springs, Nevada, Area 52 or Papoose Lake. He was a weather expert working with a theodolite. He is also featured on the Jesse Michaels podcast on YouTube, American Alchemy. It was a really interesting interview that Jesse Michaels had with Charles Hall. And also, Albuquerque UFOs, they have weekly meetings up there, and Rose and Birdie up there, they put on really good shows. Check out their website, www.abqufos.com, for some more information. I want a big thank you out there everybody who helps me to keep this show on the road. Our supporters help me out financially so I can keep this meeting free and open to the public at Otero Arts. Otero Arts makes this building space affordable. So look, next month's meeting is October 18th at 11 a.m. Hope to see you all there. Again, I'm Maria Tellier, New Mexico's State Director for MUFON. Thank you so much for your time today.